Amarjeet Sada is an Indian national who's believed to be the youngest serial killer in modern history, with him having murdered 3 children between 2006 and 2007 when he was just 7 and 8 years old. All of his victims were babies, none of whom would reach their first birthday. This case is horrific, not only because of the crimes of Sada, but the fact that despite killing his cousin and his little sister, his family covered this up, allowing him to roam around his village and snatch a 3rd child, who he strangled, and whose body he mutilated by caving her head in with a brick. Sada was a remorseless killer, who smiled and seemed amused when telling the police about what he'd done. He was described by a psychologist at the time as a, quote, sadist who derives pleasure from inflicting injuries. The terrifying thing is that Sada never spent a day in prison, and this dangerous child, now inevitably a dangerous man, is somewhere in the world, living under an assumed name. Welcome to Evil Among Us. I need to start by explaining that despite the horrific and unique nature of Amarjeet Sada's crimes, there's almost no information about him, and what's been reported is very contradictory. Depending on what you watch or read, the age and gender of the victims changes wildly. There seems to be a consensus that his last 2 victims were baby girls, under the age of 12 months old, but even their ages change in various reports. However, Sada's first victim, his cousin, has been reported as being both male and female, and anywhere between 6 months and 6 years old. Seriously, look into it. It's truly bizarre how contradictory the information is in this case. This isn't just about international publications. Reporting from the time in India contains contradictory information as well, which is very strange. To be honest, I found it easier to research cases that are decades old, compared to this one, which was only in the early 2000s. This annoys me as I want to be as accurate as possible, but I don't actually think that it's possible in this case. I think there may be a reason for this lack of information, but I'll come back to that later. Although I take this into account when doing my analysis, when it comes to the main body of the video, I'll report what seems to be the most likely victim and crime information. I just want to explain why what I say might be slightly different to what you've heard or seen before, and lay the foundations for what I say later. Amarjeet Sada's exact date of birth doesn't appear anywhere. All that's known is that he was born sometime in 1998. At the time of his crimes, he was living in the Musahari village, which is located in the Balia subdivision of Begusarai district in the Indian state of Bihar, in the east of the country. He was, initially, the only child of Balaram, who was a labourer, and his mother, Parul, who was a stay-at-home mother. The family lived in extreme poverty, but their financial state appears to be the only information I can find. I think we can speculate about what happened behind closed doors, as I will do later, but there's nothing officially recorded. Anyway, it seems that Sada was an isolated and introverted child who used to prefer playing on his own, and it's stated he had no friends. It's also reported that he'd bully other children. Sada was apparently a temperamental child, quick to anger, and he'd throw tantrums whenever he didn't get his own way. Despite this, in some of the reports that I've read, it states that Sada was a, quote, normal child. However, I find that laughable, considering what he did at the ages of 7 and 8, but I assume they mean before that. But I have little doubt that this is a lie, and that the cover-up of Sada's crimes by his family is matched by them or others trying to rewrite history in order to absolve themselves and potentially society as a whole of blame for his development and his crimes. Instead, it's clear that Amarjeet Sada was, by the age of 7, a dangerous sadist, and he would demonstrate this to the country of India and the world by killing 3 defenceless babies. In early 2006, when Amarjeet Sada was 7 years old, his maternal aunt Meena came to visit. She'd obtained a job in the city of Patna and was moving there with her husband. Apparently, she was unable to do this new job and take care of her 6-month-old child. The name of this child isn't printed anywhere, and, as I said at the beginning of the video, the gender seems to change between reports. But it seems predominantly it suggested this was a male child, so that's what I'm going to go with. Anyway, Meena approached her sister, Sada's mother, to take care of her son for the month. When she set herself up with her new job, she then sent for this child. This was all agreed. This little boy was only in the household for a number of days before he was murdered. On the day of his death, this child was left alone with Sada, whilst his mother went to the local bazaar. When he was on his own, Sada began to start pinching and slapping his cousin, causing him to wake up and begin to cry. Sada enjoyed the distress he was causing, and so escalated his behaviour, began strangling his cousin. The little boy was fighting for breath, It cried even louder and harder, clearly terrified. Sada revelled in this behaviour, and, after doing this for a while, eventually strangled his 6-month-old cousin to death. With cold attachment, Sada then took the body of this little boy to a nearby forest, picked up a brick or large stone, and beat the baby's head to a pulp. He then buried the baby's body, and simply went home. Parul, Sada's mother, came home a few hours later, and was obviously distressed because she couldn't find her nephew. Sada quickly confessed that he'd murdered his cousin, and did this without any sign of guilt. In fact, he seemed proud of what he'd done. He took his mother to the body of his cousin to prove his story. When Sada's father came home and was informed of what he'd done, he beat his son, but that was it. The police were not called, and it's clear that Sada's parents sought to cover up the murder. I've read varying reports that Mina, the child's mother, was told that her son had died in an accident, but also that she was told the truth, that Sada had killed him, but was begged to forgive him and convinced, or potentially threatened, to remain quiet. These narratives are not mutually exclusive. Mina could have been told the lie, and then, when she discovered the truth, sworn to secrecy. One thing I cannot find information on is what happened to this child's body. I assume it must have been dug up by the parents, and then they came up with a story as to how the child died. Or potentially, horrifyingly, this child was just left to rot in the ground. Regardless, it's clear that Amarjeet Sada had murdered a child, and his parents had covered it up, giving him the green light to do the same thing again, which he did, twice, in less than 18 months. In mid-2006, Amarjeet Sada's parents welcomed a little girl into the world. Again, her name is not mentioned anywhere. One day, when she was around 6 months old, so in early 2007, when Sada was 8 years old, his parents were asleep, and he strangled his little sister to death. I've read varying accounts about what Sada did with his sister's body. In most reports it states that he just threw her on the bed. However, in some, it suggested that he took her body to an isolated area, and, like his first victim, caved her head in with a brick. Regardless, when Parul woke up and tried to look for her daughter, she found she was missing, and confronted her son, who quickly admitted to murdering her. Then, quote, when his parents thrashed him and asked why he killed her, Amarjeet only uttered 3 words, just like that, and smiled like the devil. Sada showed no remorse for his actions, and apparently stated, quote, what wrong have I done in killing her? Again, Sada's parents covered this crime up. They didn't call the police, and it's unknown what happened to their daughter's body. It wasn't just Sada's parents who knew about his crimes and did nothing. It seems as though many people were aware. It was later reported that Sada's uncle, and most of his extended family, knew that he'd killed 2 children, members of their own family, and they did nothing. In addition, people in the village found out about Sada's crimes, and instead of reporting him anonymously to the police, they just gave him a wide berth. They wouldn't speak to him or his family. They referred to him as a, quote, mini serial killer. Apparently, despite everyone knowing that Sada was a very dangerous child, nothing was reported, because it was considered a, quote, family matter. No doubt this would have emboldened Amarjeet Sada further. He'd now killed 2 children, and there were no consequences to his actions. Due to a lack of information, it's really difficult to establish a timeline of Sada's crimes, but it appears there was a 12-month gap between his first and second victims. However, his third murder would occur just 2 to 3 months later. The third murder occurred on the 29th of May 2007, and by this point, Sada was apparently actively combing the streets looking for victims. On this date, he was walking past the village primary school and heard the sound of a baby crying. In one of the empty classrooms, there was a baby girl who was either 6 or 8 months old, called Khushbu, who was lying on the floor. The child's mother, Chun Devi, was apparently busy and felt that this was a safe place to put her daughter. I've read alternatively that Chun was going to the local market, but then also that she was doing chores in a house nearby. Regardless, this child was left on her own, completely unguarded. Sada took Khushbu from where she was lying and was seen by villagers carrying the now crying baby. He took her to a nearby field and strangled the child to death, and also caved in her head with a brick. Sada then buried the child's body. Chun returned a short time later and began searching for her daughter. Due to Sada being seen with a crying baby, and also because he was known to have killed 2 children already, it didn't take long for angry villagers to confront him. Within hours of killing baby Khushbu, Amarjeet Sada confessed his crimes to the villagers and took them to the location where he buried this little girl. There was no emotion. He was calm, acting as though he was simply walking people to the local shop, not the battered body of an infant. It was at this point that the villagers decided that enough was enough, and they finally contacted the authorities. Late in the afternoon of the 29th of May 2007, the phones at Bangwapa police station were ringing off the hook, with villagers from Musahari telling the police they detained an 8-year-old boy who just killed a little girl, but who had killed 2 other children before that. The police were not convinced an 8-year-old could be responsible for such horrors, but they went to investigate. When they got to the village, they found Sada being guarded by a group of adults, and they too were taken to the body of Khushbu. Sada was taken into custody and brought to the police station. It's reported at the time that, quote, even when he was taken away to the station, the young boy was staring with an icy glare at the police. It seems that at this point, one of Sada's family members, his uncle, confirmed to the police that he killed 2 children before that, his cousin and his sister. This uncle also reported the same to the media. Amarjeet Sada was questioned, and when an officer asked him whether he'd killed Khushbu, the boy replied, quote, give me a packet of biscuits and I'll tell you. Sada was given 2 packets of biscuits, and, whilst eating his treat, calmly and without any sign of guilt, remorse or nerves, told the officers how he killed Khushbu. When asked about his cousin and his sister, Sada freely admitted he'd killed them both. He was described by officers as a child who, quote, spoke little but smiled a lot. So, what did the authorities do with an 8-year-old, self-confessed serial killer? Basically, not a lot ultimately. This was largely because the Indian justice system was, and still is, not geared towards punishing, rehabilitating and monitoring people like Amarjeet Sada. Specifically, whilst the age of criminal responsibility in the country is 7 years old, the law in India at the time, as dictated by the Juvenile Justice Act 2000, stated that no child under the age of 18 could be sent to prison, regardless of the seriousness of their crimes. They could only be sent to a special home for children for 3 years, for their reformation and rehabilitation. The law was changed to some extent by the passing of the Juvenile Justice Act 2015, which allowed those aged 16 to 17 to be tried as adults, but this was only after outcry following the 2012 Delhi gang rape and murder case, which occurred on the 16th of December 2012 and involved the beating, gang rape, torture and murder of a 23-year-old woman called Jyoti Singh by 6 men on a private bus she was travelling in. 5 were adults, 1 was a juvenile. 1 of the men died before the trial. The other 4 were convicted and eventually executed in 2020. The juvenile, Mohammed Afros, was convicted of rape and murder, but due to being 17 years and 6 months old when he committed the crime, was simply sent to a special home for children for 3 years, causing national and international outcry, which led to a change in the law. However, the 2015 Act still meant that no one under the age of 16, no matter how serious the crime, could be sent to prison. Anyway, going back, because of these laws, the options with Amarjeet Sada was limited. He appeared in juvenile court on the 7th of June 2007, where he admitted all 3 murders. He was then held at Begusarai Remand Home for evaluation, being placed on a special ward on his own to ensure he didn't have access to other children to murder. Sada was assessed by various psychologists and psychiatrists and was described as a, quote, sadist who derives pleasure from inflicting injuries, as well as a child who had no concept of right and wrong. He was believed to have had conduct disorder. Conduct disorder is a serious behavioural and emotional disorder that can occur in children and teens. In general, symptoms of conduct disorder fall into 4 categories: aggressive behaviour, destructive behaviour, deceitful behaviour, and violation of rules. Children with conduct disorder often have no remorse or guilt for their actions, and some have no awareness or consideration of how their behaviour can affect others. But, in the case of those who are sadistic, they know full well the impact and enjoy the harm they cause. Conduct disorder is a condition confined to children, but is seen as an indicator of psychopathy in adulthood. Whilst this all makes sense so far, it's also reported that medical doctors believe that Sada was someone who had a mental disorder which motivated him to commit murders. However, they stated that this mental illness, quote, could be cured completely through medication and therapies. This is a really deranged statement, which I want you to remember, as I'll circle back to it in a bit. Ultimately, the sentence of Amarjeet Sada was set by law, and he was sentenced to 3 years confinement, but not in prison. It appears from what I've read, He was sent to a psychiatric facility for these 3 years, where he accessed medication and therapy, and then moved to a juvenile home, where he remained for a number of years, before being released, apparently at the age of 16, but some reports say 18, with a new identity. Due to how dangerous Sada was considered, he spent most of his time in solitary confinement, away from other children, who he'd likely tried to murder. Amarjeet Sada is apparently still alive today, and is approximately 25 years old. His current location is unknown. He's apparently changed his name to Samarjeet, although this isn't confirmed. It's also not known what he looks like, or whether he's killed again, this time under his new name. I've wanted to cover the crimes of Amarjeet Sada for a while, but I was reluctant for the reasons I mentioned at the beginning of the video about contradictory information. But as I looked into the case more, I felt compelled to report on it, as I became more and more angry about the situation, both within the family and in the wider society, that created this child and enabled him to kill again and again. To be clear, as I said in another video, I won't shy away from difficult cases and will speak my mind. And to inform what I'm saying now, I've read many articles written by people both in India and outside the country, but I'm happy to be corrected if I say something wrong. But also, I'd really appreciate someone bravely standing up and saying if what I say is true, and also elaborating on the situation, so that we all get an education. Also, when I say things like, some in India think this or that, this is obviously not saying all people in the country think this way, but without actually discussing issues and constantly fearing offending people, nothing changes. So, I read somewhere about the fact that Sada's mother and his aunt did not report his first crime because they were trying to protect him. I don't believe this is true at all. I think it was all about protecting the family name. Unfortunately, from what I've read, India is a society built on a caste system, which divides people into ranked categories, which dictates all aspects of their social lives, including professions they can work in, who they can marry, associate with, etc. It's my understanding that surnames in India are a way to identify the caste that people belong to. Protecting the family name and standing appears to be of paramount importance in order to maintain this social standing. This can lead to an environment of secrecy, where violence and horrific acts of abuse within the family are known about but ignored. This creates a horrific situation, which I think explains the creation and enabling of Amarjeet Sada and why his crimes were unreported. So, starting at the beginning, I read a terrible statistic in a Times of India article from earlier this year, which suggested that because of the secretive nature of families in India, around 80 to 90% of children suffer some form of abuse at the hands of a family member, with the perpetrators feeling confident that they can get away with their crimes as no one will report them or try to stop them. Amarjeet Sada being part of this 80 to 90% would go a very long way to explaining the dangerous child he became. If he was, as I suspect, subject to abuse at the hands of a family member, and or witnessed the same against others in the same household, especially violence, this would have led him to develop attitudes and beliefs where this was the way to treat people, and that violence against people was a way to feel powerful. This would have likely meant that Sada didn't develop any guilt or remorse for his actions, which he saw as entirely normal. His actions could have been him replicating what he saw, taking pleasure from the fact that he was the abuser rather than the abused. Sada's development, I think, was so damaged that, as I've mentioned on several occasions, it genuinely appears he had no concept of right or wrong. He killed his sister and then turned to his mother and actually said, quote, "What wrong have I done in killing her?" He freely confessed to his crimes without batting an eyelid because, in his mind, he was simply telling others what he'd done, with no awareness that it was wrong. Whilst there's no information about what the household was like, I believe part of the horror of this case is likely what happened behind closed doors, which created a child like Amarjeet Sada, which has not been reported or potentially suppressed. So Sada, in my opinion, was created by his environment and began to act on what he'd been taught, starting with his cousin. When he killed this little boy, it was covered up in order to keep all awareness of this terrible act from those outside the family. I also firmly believe this is why Sada murdering his sister was covered up. Again, the family name and their standing in the community was paramount. Essentially, as long as the family name is maintained, it doesn't matter whether the actual family members abuse or even kill each other, and if this occurs, it needs to be covered up. However, by covering things up, you create a situation that just feeds into itself. In the case of Sada, you had a child who had no concept of right and wrong, felt violence was okay, and killed one child, and then nothing happened. What message did this send him? It told him he was correct, Killing people's fine, and, as he enjoyed it, he wanted to do it again, and he did, killing his own sister. Then, nothing happened again, so off he went, searching the streets looking for another victim, with him quickly finding one. I don't know about the makeup of villages in rural parts of India, or how these communities operate, but I do find it inexplicable that a woman would leave her 6-month-old daughter unattended whilst doing chores generally, and especially in a village where, whilst no one was acknowledging it, a double murderer was lurking about. Anyway, killing Khushbu appeared to be the final straw. It was no longer a quote family matter, it affected the safety of everyone, and only then was this dangerous child stopped. However, potentially all the victims were in fact girls, which raises another possibility as to why these crimes were covered up. Specifically, looking into this aspect of things opened up a can of worms about the attitudes of a concerningly large part of Indian society related to the views of girls and women, with them being treated like second-class citizens. I read a disturbing number of articles about baby girls being buried alive and dumped like rubbish, with no one apparently giving a shit. Also, I read about the horrifying number of acid attacks against women in the country, with there being at least 1,000 of these between 2017 and 2021, although this is just those reported. The numbers that actually happened are slightly much higher. I'm going to do a video or videos about crimes in India to highlight this, likely starting with the 2012 Delhi rape case, but what I've read so far is truly appalling. That was an aside, but going back to Amarjeet Sada, I think generally his crimes were covered up to protect the family name, but if his first 2 victims were both girls, as some outlets report, then this was potentially far easier to justify in the minds of those involved, because he only killed girls, so his crimes were considered less serious. I may be off the mark, I don't think I am, but I think you'll agree that whatever the reasons for Amarjeet Sada's crimes being covered up, there's something truly sickening and inhuman about the family that created and enabled this monster. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist or anything, but when I look into this case I get the distinct impression that it was swept under the carpet as quickly as possible. This includes the really bizarre statement which was made in court about Amarjeet Sada being curable through a combination of medication and therapy. Anyone who's worked with people who are diagnosed psychopaths or have other extreme personality disorders will know there is no cure for this type of condition. Therapy and medication may help to some extent, but this is to manage traits which the sufferer will have to deal with for the rest of their lives. Now, either the person who said that doesn't know what they're talking about, or, more likely, they wanted Sada to be seen as an anomaly, someone who was simply unwell, who would be cured, allowing any questions about the environment and society which created and enabled him to be deflected, allowing the status quo to continue. So you could ask, well, what about his home life? Do you think that had an impact on him? Nope, he's just mentally unwell, don't worry, we'll cure him, no more questions please. He and his crimes then slipped into the background. I get the impression this is why the reporting in this case was so bad. Reporters were getting stonewalled by the authorities, so tried to cobble things together on their own, and came up with different accounts which contradict each other. Again, it feels as though the intention was for Amarjeet Sada to be forgotten as quickly as possible. This meant there was no debate, no change in the law, nothing. The law did change as a result of the 2012 Delhi rape case, but this appears to have been due to international coverage and condemnation. With Sada, his crimes, despite how horrific they were, slipped under the radar. And then, years later, when no one was watching, he simply slipped back into the world. Even when he was released is unclear. This is particularly terrifying. I've read nothing which indicates he'll be monitored, or anyone told who he is. Instead, he's simply been let back into society. Has he committed any more crimes under his new name? I believe almost certainly, as Amarjeet Sada, despite attempts to minimise and ignore what he did, was an extremely dangerous child, with no concept of right and wrong, no empathy, and a love of violence, who I have no doubt is out there now, a 25-year-old man who has these same horrific traits. So, had you heard about the crimes of Amarjeet Sada, dubbed the world's youngest serial killer? Honestly, given the lack of information in this case, if anyone has anything to add, that'd be great. If you like what I do here, then please consider supporting the channel. You can become a channel member by clicking the join button, which is £2.99 a month, or around $4. Also, if you want to send a one-off donation, then click the thanks button. Please like, share and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.